All right. I guess we shall start. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's ECOP Wednesday. My name is Anjali Gopakumar. I'm an EMB Young Ambassador alumni, and I will be moderating our session today. So as always, we plan to have an hour-long session where the first half will be focused on the talk from our speaker today, Dr. Pradeep Singh, and the second half will be dedicated to questions that you have for him based on his talk or on the topic in general. So the first half of the session will be recorded and will be available on YouTube, while the second half with the discussion and the questions will not be recorded. So coming to our housekeeping rules. So please make sure that your name is clearly entered so that we know who is asking the questions, who we're talking to. And please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. Raise your hand if you would like to speak, or instead, if you would prefer to not talk, just you can use the chat function to make comments and to ask questions. As always, we request that you please be respectful and use appropriate language. And yes, so now coming a little bit about our ECOP network. So the ECOP network was created by the EMB Young Ambassadors and the EMB Secretariat as a platform for networking and peer-to-peer interaction for early career ocean professionals at EMB member organizations, and also so they can help gain a voice at the EMB level. We also have a dedicated Slack channel that we use to keep in touch and to discuss events. And one of the activities that we have as part of the network is the ECOP Wednesday event series. And yes, so now on to the main part of our session. We have a fantastic speaker today, Dr. Pradeep Singh, who will be talking about the pursuit of deep seabed mining in the face of uncertainty, what's happening at the International Seabed Authority, and where are things headed. Dr. Pradeep is a fellow at the Research Institute for Sustainability, Helmholtz Center in Potsdam. He is also the deputy chair of the Ocean Law Specialist Group of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, and the lead of the Commission on Ecosystem Management's thematic group on deep seabed mining. Dr. Pradeep regularly attends multilateral ocean negotiations, including meetings of the International Seabed Authority, one of which he recently attended in March. And he also advises several governments and actors on deep seabed mining, ocean governance, and marine biodiversity conservation in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So we're all really excited for your talk, Dr. Pradeep. So please go ahead. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much to the European Marine Board, and thank you, Anjali and Paula as well. Let me start by sharing my slides. Let me get this to full screen. Yeah, so I hope it's on full screen and you can see the slides and hear me well, but please interrupt if you don't. Okay, so I will be talking today about, the pursuit of deep seabed mining in the face of uncertainties, and essentially to provide an overview of what's currently going on at the International Seabed Authority and where things are headed. And it's quite a timely presentation, I guess, because the recent meeting of the ISA Council just concluded last week, and I just got back on the weekend, so I would be happy to bring some insights on where things actually stand and what to watch out for up until the next meeting in July. But very first, I think for the benefit of everyone in the audience, I'm going to give a very quick overview or introduction to what deep seabed mining is, what is the the International Seabed Area, before introducing the ISA and its mandates, responsibilities. So I'll try to go through these slides very quickly before looking at the current state of affairs at the ISA. Also, a quick look at other developments that pertain to or have an implication on the work of the ISA. And then in conclusion, point to where things are headed. And I'm particularly looking forward to the discussion that would take place right after the presentation. So, most of you would be familiar with how the zonal system works under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Essentially, coastal states are entitled to an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles, as well as a continental shelf. So basically a seabed area up to 200 nautical miles as well. Under certain conditions, this can be extended under the extended continental shelf regime in UNCLOS. And essentially, when we speak about the exclusive economic zone, the areas beyond the exclusive economic zone, so beyond the water column of the exclusive economic zone area, that falls under what is known as the high seas. But in the case of the international seabed area, that starts where the continental shelf or the extended continental shelf, as the case may be, ends. And so essentially both the high seas and the area are known as areas beyond national jurisdiction. But I think it's very important to know that the size of the area, so the international seabed, is not equivalent to the size of the high seas. And I think this sort of diagram or figure sort of gives us a good indication of what I mean by that. And so you have the areas in blue, which is essentially the exclusive economic zones of coastal states. And then you have the areas that have been marked here in red, which are existing or already approved extended continental shelf claims by coastal states that, of course, go beyond the 200 nautical mile limit. And so when we talk about the international seabed area, it's essentially those areas that you see in white, which is, as mentioned, smaller than the high seas area. So essentially, when we say the high seas, we're talking about somewhere around 2/3 of the world ocean space. But when it comes to the area, we're perhaps looking at about 55% of the seabed area being the area that is under the remit of the International Seabed Authority. But also just to sort of set the scene a little bit more, some of you may have, gone through the convention, page by page for many times, but I think it's very helpful to sort of, put down how the convention is sort of divided into several parts. And you have, all the way from part 2 up until part 11, that's essentially focused on sort of maritime zones. But from after part 11, you have the more general provisions on protection of the marine environment, MSR, transfer of technology, settlement of disputes, and so on. We're going to focus a little bit more on part 11, which sets out the regime for the international seabed area. But of course, this also pertains to, or when we speak about deep seabed mining, that also pertains to part 6, for example, the continental shelf and the extended continental shelf, because deep seabed mining activities could also occur in these areas, as well as sort of, for you to sort of bear in mind also that, part 12, part 13 of the convention also applies to the area. So just to highlight that from the outset. But let's go, right into part 11 of the convention, and allow me just to take you through very quickly some of the fundamental principles on under part 11. So it's very clear that the area, the international seabed area and its mineral resources are the common heritage of humankind. What this means is that, no state or actors can actually exercise any form of sovereignty or sovereign rights over this space. So all rights in the resources are vested in humankind as a whole, on whose behalf the International Seabed Authority shall act. States can and will be held responsible under international law for any damage caused by failures to carry out its responsibilities under Part 11. But specifically, Article 140 says that, exploration and exploitation activities in the area shall be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole. Financial and other economic benefits derived from such activities shall be distributed through an equitable benefit sharing mechanism. And Article 145, which is very important, even as we speak about deep seabed mining today, is that the effective protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of mining activities shall be ensured, and the ISA needs to take necessary measures to this end. Very quickly, what is deep seabed mining? Essentially, we're talking about exploration and eventual exploitation of mineral deposits at depths greater than 200 meters. These minerals can be found in seabed areas within national jurisdiction, as well as seabed areas beyond national jurisdiction, and the area is the terminology used for the international seabed area. When we speak about mineral resources that are found on the continental shelf or on the extended continental shelf, coastal states actually have sovereign rights to explore and exploit these resources. But when it comes to mineral resources in the area, these resources can only be accessed through the International Seabed Authority, and the benefits, as mentioned, are to be shared equitably through a mechanism developed by the ISA. So the three main resource types that we are sort of, primarily referring to when we speak about deep seabed mining, particularly in the context of the ISA, are polymetallic nodules. So these are located in abyssal plains at average depths between 4,000 to 6,000 meters, known to have main metal contents of nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese. You have polymetallic sulfides, which are located at hydrothermal vents, at average depths of 1,400 to 3,700 meters, with metal contents of copper, lead, zinc, gold, and silver, as well as some rare earth elements. And then you have cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts found at seamounts at average depths between 800 to 2,400 meters that mainly contain cobalt. As mentioned, these resources can be located in areas within national jurisdiction, so on the continental shelf or extended continental shelf, but they are also found on the international seabed. So in the case of polymetallic nodules, we're looking at about 70 to 80% of these resources being on the international seabed area. But in the case of polymetallic sulfides and cobalt-rich crusts, these are more spread across the continental shelf of coastal states, as well as the international seabed area. Very quickly, because the topic of the presentation is about regulating deep seabed mining in the face of uncertainties. There are many uncertainties. I will focus mainly on environmental ones, but also some underlying themes that we would come through later on in the presentation. There are also issues of equity as well as benefit sharing. But in terms of environmental implications of deep seabed mining, we know that this takes millions of years to form. Organisms are dependent on the minerals themselves, so on the nodules itself. And I think this is interesting because at the point in time when the convention was negotiated in the 1960s and the 1970s, we knew very little about the deep seabed. And I think back then it was thought that this would be an area that's more or less like a desert with very little or no life. But now, scientific discovery is sort of, bringing to light more evidence on the importance of the deep seabed, as well as for life. In terms of vents and seamounts, we know that they are full of life and they attract marine mammals as well in the case of seamounts. We know that the deep ocean is not used to direct human disturbances, as well as indications that the current extractive methods that are envisaged are thought to be highly destructive and invasive. Current knowledge indicates that restoration of the deep seabed after mining activities is not possible. We know very little about the potential impact of noise, vibration, and light on marine life, as well as how this could affect marine mammals, still not known. The impacts will be three-dimensional, and plumes could spread quite a distance, and there's now a lot of research sort of focused on this sedimentation and plumes. The benefits of the natural capital that we obtain from the deep ocean, that's something that is still yet to be quantified. But we know that the deep ocean plays an important role in regulating climate, provision of key services, as well as sustaining the marine food web. Might be a potential source for future medicinal and pharmaceutical needs. And I think, just to end this slide, it's still, scientific knowledge is progressing, but the current environmental baseline data that we have for the deep seabed is still very poor. And this includes also areas that, are currently under exploration at the ISA. So now very quickly coming to the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, what is this body? It's an autonomous international organization established under Part 11 of the convention. And it has, as mentioned earlier, mandate over the mineral resources of the area, with the ISA acting on behalf of humankind as a whole. The ISA is essentially responsible for, establishing policies to govern the mineral resources of the area, to develop regulations for exploration and exploitation in future, to consider and decide whether or not to award mining contracts, to collect payments from contractors, particularly during exploration, to facilitate the equitable sharing of benefits derived from mining activities, to use that or to use some of that funds, very interestingly, to compensate land-based mining developing countries for the adverse economic impacts that they suffer as a result of deep seabed mining. So this is another question of equity as well that comes up in the case of seabed mining and the ISA. And the reason that we have this provision in the convention, or this mandate for the ISA to compensate land-based mining developing countries is because it is thought, and it is the case, that deep seabed mining activities sanctioned by the ISA would in fact be competition to land-based mining, and that could affect the income or earnings of developing countries whose economies are reliant on terrestrial mining, while at the same time ensuring the effective protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of mining activities, as well as to promote marine scientific research. So when we say the ISA, I think it's important to bear in mind, who is the ISA? There is, the tendency to conflate the ISA with the administrative arm of the ISA. And so I think it's very important to go back to the convention to sort of understand what the ISA is. And it's basically the organization through which member states organize and control exploration and exploitation activities in the area. So essentially all contracting parties to the convention are automatically member states to the ISA. And as of today, we have 167 states and the European Union. The primary organs of the ISA are the Assembly and the Council, which are the political bodies where states are represented. And the Secretariat is essentially the administrative body and should not be conflated as being the ISA in itself. As I mentioned, there is the tendency to sort of look to the ISA Secretariat as being the ISA, but it's essentially the Assembly and the Council that really is the ISA. And so we see on this diagram on the right, essentially, providing more information on what the Assembly is. It's the supreme and political body of the ISA with the power to establish general policies of the ISA, as well as to approve the budget and to also approve regulations based on the recommendations of Council. It is not the body that makes the executive decision, so it does not decide in any particular case whether or not to approve an application. That decision is made by the Council, which comprises of 36 states divided into 5 groups, representing interest from the major consumers of commodities, the major investors in deep seabed mining. Group C is on land-based producers. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it's important to take into account the adverse impacts that land-based mining countries would have. You have Group D, which is basically for developing states and states with special interests. And then finally, you have Group E, which comprises of equitable geographic representation. The council, or the work of the council, is basically dependent on its subsidiary bodies. The Economic Planning Commission, although envisaged by the convention, is still not yet in operation. The functions of that body is carried out by the Legal and Technical Commission, which also has a host of other responsibilities, including to provide technical and environmental expertise to the council. But it's also this body that would first evaluate and make recommendations to the council on whether or not to approve any application for exploration or in future exploitation activities. So I think this essentially, tells us more about the ISA, which is not limited to the Secretariat. There's also a 4th organ that is envisaged under the convention, and that is called the enterprise. The enterprise is established under the convention, but it's not yet in operation. So essentially, the enterprise is the entrepreneurial arm of the ISA. It's the body that has the mandate to carry out mining activities on its own as representing the ISA, and talks or negotiations are currently ongoing as to how this organ can be brought into operation. And some countries, especially African countries, have sort of in recent years been very vocal on this topic because they see the enterprise as the body that represents humankind as a whole and would be the ideal way for mining activities to be carried out. Current state of affairs, and I guess this is where it comes to sort of like, more substance for those of you already familiar with the ISA. And so the I guess next 10 minutes will be focused on current developments. The ISA is going to turn 30 next year. So at the moment, it's 29 years old. Exploration has been going on for a little over 2 decades now. So we have the nodule exploration regulations that were adopted in the year 2000, and contracts for nodule exploration were signed shortly after that. We have the regulations for polymetallic sulfides that were adopted in 2010, and we have the crust regulations that were adopted in 2012. So we have a total of 31, should be corrected to be 30 contracts awarded at the moment, primarily for nodules and some for sulfides and crusts. And the reason why this should be amended to 30 is because the contract that sponsored by Brazil is now in the process of being revoked, simply because the area that was previously under the exploration contract has now been brought into the extended continental shelf of Brazil. And so they would then exercise sovereign rights over this area. And so the contract with the ISA is being revoked for this purpose. Contracts, this chart sort of basically shows us the existing ISA contracts and where they are located. A big chunk of that is basically in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is at the very left of this diagram. As mentioned, most contracts are there. You also have some contracts for sulfides at the mid-Atlantic ridge, as you can see somewhere in the middle. And then in the southern Indian Ocean, you also have quite a few contracts for polymetallic sulfides. And when we look into the Western Pacific Ocean, we see the contracts for cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts that are there. Now, some of you may already be aware of this, but there is now a current push for the ISA to move from exploration towards exploitation. And a lot of this process is, sort of due, or the acceleration of this process is due to the invocation of a treaty provision that was invoked by the Republic of Nauru at the end of June 2021. I will come back to this a little later, but at the moment, the ISA is channeling a lot of efforts towards developing what is called the mining code and the regulations for exploitation activities. But against this backdrop, calls for a moratorium or a pause or a moratorium is also sort of growing, and France has also indicated that their desire for a ban on deep seabed mining activities. Which actually makes this makes things for very interesting at the moment. So what's going on with the ISA's mining code and the exploitation regulations? So Council recently concluded the first part of the 28th session of its meeting that took place from the 16th to the 31st of March. So essentially for 2.5 weeks. And during this meeting, there was a lot of work. About 80% of the time of this meeting was dedicated to negotiating. Sorry, someone has mic is on, perhaps? Yeah. So yeah, during the meeting, about 80% of the time of the meeting was spent on continuing the negotiations of the draft text of the exploitation regulation. So the draft text was presented to the Council in July 2019. Initial work happened between the July 2019 meeting and February 2020. And then we had the COVID pandemic, and the ISA only resumed its meetings or its in-person meetings last year in 2022. We had 3 meetings back then. And then we had the first meeting of this year that just concluded. And so negotiations continued through the work of informal working groups. We have one on the protection and preservation of the marine environment. And in this working group, we completed the second reading of the provisions that fall under this working group. It's quite clear that there are still a lot of outstanding matters that need to be resolved, such as, environmental impact assessments or the environmental management and monitoring plans, which would need a lot more time to negotiate. So even though we had the second reading of the provisions within this working group, it's very clear that, there's still a lot of diverging views in this working group. And indeed, for this working group, I think we are left with intersessional work of between 7 to 8 different intersessional working groups. There's also the working group on inspection, compliance, and enforcement, where we also completed the second reading of provisions. And there is one, I guess, outstanding matter in this working group, which sort of, is more of an institutional matter. Do we have an inspectorate, an independent inspectorate, or should this inspectorate be under the remit of the Secretariat or the Legal and Technical Commission? Whereas some states are calling for the establishment of a compliance committee that would exercise oversight over compliance matters. And so this is one matter that's also going to take up some time during the intersessional period between now and April. We have a working group on institutional matters, and in this working group, we completed the partial first reading of some provisions. I think there's still about 10 to 15 provisions that we've not even done the first reading. So this working group would, certainly require more time. And I think one sticky issue from this institutional matters working group is to sort of come up with an approach to how to determine the relationship between a sponsoring state and the entity that it sponsors. So essentially, not just ensuring that the entity that it sponsors has the nationality requirement of the sponsoring state, but also to ask, in more detail, this question of whether or not there is actually effective control over the mining entity that it sponsors. And I think this is very important because as we've sort of seen already in an advisory opinion from the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea in 2011, that if this relationship between the sponsoring state and the mining entity is not properly regulated, then this might be abused and result in a phenomena known as sponsoring states of convenience, whereby you have entities from developed states that just set up an office or a business registration in developing states in order to get sponsorship from those states and be subjected to lesser requirements. And so this is another topic that this working group would need to resolve and probably would take quite a substantial bit of time to come to the bottom of this. And then we have the working group on financial terms. So essentially the royalties and profit sharing requirements that contractors would have to pay to the ISA. And things are still quite far from being concluded in this respect. There are 4 models that are on the table that have been proposed by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But at the very last meeting that just ended, we also had experts from the IGF, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, that attended the council meeting and presented some of their views from terrestrial and experience from terrestrial mining. And so that would be factored in now as to how should we develop the royalty and profit sharing mechanisms for deep seabed mining under the ISA. And very interesting also is that we are awaiting a study that has been commissioned by the ISA on how to internalize the environmental externalities of deep seabed mining activities. Essentially, how do we quantify the loss of natural capital and then other services provided by the deep seabed and factor that into the royalty and profit sharing mechanisms in accordance with the polluter pays principle. There are a lot of other provisions that do not fall within any one of the above working groups, and we are, or at least the council is dealing with those provisions through what is called the precedence text. And in this last meeting, we completed the first reading of the President's text, although there still remains a lot of work to be done, particularly because states were not very much prepared to deal with some of the technical provisions, such as the annexes. And I think this would come up again at the next meeting, and then states would be more prepared to progress in this working group. So the next meetings for this year, we will have the council meeting on the 10th to the 21st of July, and again 30th October to 8th November. The assembly would also meet in July from the 24th of July to the 28th of July, so for 5 days. But I wanted to come back to this deadline of this 2-year rule provision that I mentioned was invoked by the Republic of Nauru, and the deadline for that provision would expire on the 9th of July 2023. So I think it's very interesting to sort of highlight that the deadline ends on the 9th of July and the council is only meeting next on the 10th of July. But more crucially, what this provision provides that if the council is not able to complete the adoption of the regulation and an application for the approval of a plan of work for exploitation is submitted, that application would nevertheless have to be considered and can be provisionally approved by the council, notwithstanding the fact that the regulations remain absent. And I think this is important because under the convention and in general under the ISA regime, the ISA is not empowered to authorize mining activities without the regulations, but this provision provides a small window of exception. But even so, and this is a lot of my recent work, sort of concluding that even though there is this countdown deadline for the ISA, for the council to complete the regulations, there's actually no need to rush. And in fact, I am of the view that if the deadline is missed, the council still retains the power to actually reject an application if that is so desired. I will come back to this a little later. But I also wanted to point out very quickly developments that are happening elsewhere, which would of course have an implication on the ISA. And I want to start with the final text of this new BBNJ agreement. So basically, which will take the form of an implementing agreement to the Law of the Sea Convention. But essentially, it's basically a treaty for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that's how you get the acronym BBNJ. The final text was actually adopted on March 4th. And we are still awaiting a date that will follow soon for this agreement to be adopted, and then states would be able to sign and ratify this agreement, and it will come into force a year after the 60th ratification instrument is deposited. And it really depends if you are a person of or someone which is looks at it as a glass half empty or a glass half full kind of a person. We have Article 4, which essentially in paragraph 2 says that this agreement should be interpreted and applied in a manner that doesn't undermine existing instruments and arrangements, including those under sectoral bodies. But you also have Article 6, paragraph 2, which requires parties to the BBNJ agreement or the forthcoming BBNJ agreement to promote the objectives of this BBNJ agreement in other sectoral and regional bodies. Which also then sort of ensures that or seeks to ensure that activities carried out in areas beyond national jurisdiction are in harmony with each other. I will skip this slide because I just wanted to point out that there are a lot of overlaps between the BBNJ text and the work of the ISA, but happy to take this on during the discussion if there are questions. But I also want to point out another recent development as well, which is basically under the Convention of Biological Diversity, also looking towards the BBNJ in terms of sustainable development goals, as well as the 30 by 30 target that was recently adopted in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that applies also in the context of BBNJ. And I think, just to also point out one of the decisions that was also taken during that same COP, which basically also speaks to deep seabed mining, sort of basically encouraging parties to the CBD COP and inviting other non-parties governments as well to ensure that before seabed mining exploitation activities take place, the impacts on the marine environment, biodiversity is sufficiently understood, technology and operational practices do not cause harmful effects, and appropriate rules, regulations, and procedures are first put in place by the ISA. And so, BBNJ, CBD, this sort of developments there also have a bearing on the work of the ISA. So to quickly now conclude and to get into the discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to, basically what next, what to expect. So there's going to be a lot of intersessional work within the intersessional working groups that I sort of mentioned earlier between now and the July meeting. I think there are about 8 to 10 thematic groups that have been established by the council. So there's going to be a lot of work. States are also, and observers and other actors are also now invited to provide written comments to the current version of the text, and those will be due by the 15th of May. And so there's going to be a lot of work, and from the 15th of May, the facilitators of the working groups will prepare a new revised text that will then be used for the basis of the negotiations in July. The informal dialogue on the what if scenario, so essentially what would happen if the ISA misses the deadline and an application is submitted. Discussions on this will continue, and this is a topic that I've been working and following very closely. I think it's important to bear in mind that the informal dialogue and the discussions that we had during the March meeting have sort of indicated areas where there is emerging consensus. So there is no obligation for the ISA or for the council to provisionally approve any application that is submitted before then. I think this is very important because at this time last year, there was the misapprehension that applications would have to be automatically approved. But now it's very clear that the mainstream view is that the council can actually reject applications. And I think also there's growing consensus, and many states have voiced this view, that mining activities cannot commence without the regulations first being in place. Also, I think what has sort of come out in the last months of discussion on this topic is that the areas of diverging views have been narrowed down. So essentially, perhaps there are maybe just 2 or 3 questions that remain. So the first question is whether or not the council can just postpone the consideration of applications until the regulations are ready. Another area where there's still diverging views is whether and what is the role of the Legal and Technical Commission in evaluating applications. And this is proving to be quite a divisive topic, but the majority is essentially saying that the council retains control over mining applications, and the Legal and Technical Commission should, of course, work in evaluating applications based on any guidance or directives provided to it by the council. There's also diverging views on what would the implications of a provisionally approved plan of work mean. And essentially, many states have argued that the provisional approval of a plan of work does not necessarily equate to a contract, and it's only a contract that allows mining activities to commence. So even if the council decides to provisionally approve a plan of work, that really doesn't mean that mining activities would start. In fact, they can still be postponed, and the approval or provisional approval of a plan of work would need to be revisited and decided upon again once the regulations come into place. So yeah, July will be a very crucial meeting, but I think it's already important to recognize, as some delegates has already mentioned at the closing of the last meeting, that there's still a very long way to go in the negotiations, and this will not be ready anytime soon. And also just to highlight that it's not just the regulations that need to be agreed and adopted. Many states have also sort of said that, we actually need to go beyond the regulations and agree on those matters, such as developing environmental thresholds, which could take still several years, agreeing on necessary standards and guidelines, which would give effect to the regulations, to come up with a mechanism, an equitable mechanism for benefit sharing, as well as to resolve any sort of issues of potential liability. And I'm just putting this slide out because, it was based on a paper that I wrote in 2021, but it's still very relevant to today, because there's just so many outstanding matters that still need to be resolved. So I won't deal with this slide, but, please, go and check out the paper if you're interested, just to sort of highlight that there are many, many, many matters that still need to be debated and agreed upon. So in conclusion, we know that the ocean is currently facing unprecedented levels of threat. Deep seabed mining is being considered in the midst of an urgent need to protect the marine environment, to reduce and eliminate loss of marine biodiversity, to improve ocean health, as well as to reverse ocean degradation. And in this respect, deep seabed mining is at odds with other ocean ambitions that states have sort of expressed in various fora. It's, in my view, not a sustainable option. I think there's this, misconception that because the metals that can be derived from deep seabed mining could be used for the green transition, that in itself makes deep seabed mining sustainable. But I have argued in some of my work that this is not the case. And deep seabed mining, being as destructive as it's currently assumed, may actually go against what we understand as sustainable. In fact, I argue that, based on, the current understanding of how things work, instead of replacing or reducing terrestrial mining, allowing deep seabed mining to commence might actually exacerbate or increase terrestrial mining and exacerbate many of the problems that we have with terrestrial mining, simply because you're adding a new form of competition, and terrestrial miners would then compete and might even reduce their standards. So that's something to bear in mind. We also need more scientific information to close existing knowledge gaps. Scientists have indicated that this could take somewhere between 10 to 15 years. And that does not mean that, close scientific gaps so that mining can commence, but rather close scientific knowledge gaps so that we can make a more informed decision on whether or not to allow seabed mining to happen. In short, I guess this requires more time and more debate, and hence, it's obvious why the calls for a pause or moratorium basically keeps growing. And we had 2 or 3 countries at the last meeting voice their support for a pause or moratorium. So to end with this, the deep seabed mining and the minerals of the area being the common heritage of humankind, and mining activities to be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole, I think it's important to look behind legal or legalities and start thinking about questions of equity and legitimacy of deep seabed mining as sanctioned by the ISA. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pradeep. That was such